Welcome to another episode of the 905er podcast. I'm Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
In last Thursday's 905 Roundup, you mentioned a new idea that would be mooted the same day in Hamilton media as a way to potentially solve the current homeless crisis. That idea is being promoted by the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters, or HATS, an alliance of poverty reduction activists, churches, and prominent Hamilton residents looking to reproduce a successful project launched in 2019 in Kitchener. To discuss the background to the HATS project and why it's being seen by some as an innovative approach to provide decent transitional temporary housing for Hamilton's homeless, we spoke to former MPP for Ancaster-Dundas-Flamborough-Westdale and former Minister of, among other ministries, Municipal Affairs and Housing and Community and Social Services, the Honourable Ted McMeekin. Today, Ted describes himself as a lifetime community volunteer, interested in affordable housing, homelessness, and basic income, desirous of bending the world toward social justice. Hey, well, welcome, the Honourable Ted McMeekin to the 905er podcast. Great to have you today to talk about the HATS project, the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters, and this new proposal that just started to come together pretty much last week. So perhaps for anybody who hasn't noticed this story in the local media, could you describe what it is and how this idea came to be?
Sure. Well, homelessness has been a problem in Hamilton for some time. Anybody who's been following the issue will read numerous stories about conflicts in neighborhood parks with tents being ripped out, bylaw being enforced that homeless people can't stay in the parks. It's a problem, and it's not an ideal solution. An ideal solution happened to exist up in Kitchener. They faced similar circumstances, and some people came together and they created what was called the Better Tent City. Eventually, by the way, it's on municipally owned property. Along the way, they developed a cadre of identifiable people in need, some 52, I believe, in 48 sheds or cabins. We prefer to call them cabins. And they formed a community together, and the community governs itself. There are some understandings around what kind of behavior is tolerated as a community, and people live by that. And there are support services delivered to what turns out to be a place where people can gather in community. A lot of folk don't want to go to shelters, even if they're in a hotel room or a motel room. That's not the end of the journey. You still have to deal with the loneliness and the trauma and the mental health challenges. There's a reason why these folk are living rough, because they're turned away from existing shelters and places that are supposed to help. So we want to create, as they have done in Kitchener, a Better Tent City. We're calling it the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters at Sir Johnny Macdonald High School site in Hamilton, which would be a safe and secure site surrounded by all kinds of caring people who want to befriend and where possible assist our homeless brothers and sisters to kind of get hold of their lives and move forward.
On that note, there are the naysayers. I'm going to kind of jump in and play devil's advocate for a moment.
Well, the devil always needs an advocate. So go ahead.
Hopefully, I do him justice. But the naysayers are going to say, well, we already have systems in place, like as you mentioned, the shelter system, mission services, various charities, etc. Why should we? Isn't this just permanently entrenching homelessness in Hamilton by just giving them a free house?
Well, I can respond to that at two levels. First of all, it clearly isn't working. If you have 104 people living rough in the middle of winter, who for whatever reason or combination of reasons, you don't get shelter in the traditional services if you have a pet. You don't get shelter in the traditional services if you're a couple. You don't get shelter in the traditional services if you have a mental health problem or any kind of addiction. So the people who are most in need of assistance are the ones that are service restricted and are most at risk. Living rough is a risky proposition, and we don't think the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters is the answer. We believe permanent housing is the answer. But to those who say to us, and some have, well, we don't like your project because we're aiming for permanent housing. My response has been, well, okay, give me assurance right now that you can permanently house everybody that's living rough, and we'll stop our efforts. But that's not going to happen. The city itself, which has responded to, I think, about 600 homeless folk and placed them either in shelters or hotels or motels, admit quite candidly that they don't have any of the services that are needed to surround these people to give them the kind of assistance they need. So, our focus is on mobilizing and doing some capacity building, looking for some funds from senior levels of government for mental health supports and what have you, so that the folk who are wherever they're housed, can get the support services they need. So we see this as a modest effort to supplement existing things that are happening in ways that are people-centered and objectively designed to be of specific assistance to homeless people.
And just to speak a bit more about the Kitchener project, which started a year or so ago, I believe.
3 years
really,
ago.
that long, yeah.
3 years, yeah.
And my understanding is that they've gone through a couple of sites, but the location where they are now seems to have be working out for them. And how is? I mean, it seems to be viewed as a success. Is it sort of universally seen that way in the community? Is it achieving the aims that everybody hopes it is?
Yes, very much so. The Waterloo region just recently awarded the Better Tent City their Barn Raiser of the Year, which is an award they give to a successful community development group that makes the most significant contribution to the community. And this site, which has come from facing some initial critique, to the unanimous support of both Kitchener and Waterloo regional councils, to the point where when they had to move from the different sites to a new site, the municipalities have actually provided the site. Right now, the site is on a piece of land that's jointly owned by the school board and the city of Kitchener. And the mayor of the city of Kitchener is a big fan, and he's been an advocate. He's been connecting with other cities and towns who want to do something like this, and it's taking off right across the country.
Can you maybe give us some insight into what it's actually like in the Hamilton site? That what has been the reception, and is it what would it be like a day on an average day in the site?
Well, that's a good question, and we're yet to experience what it would be like here in Hamilton. But piecing together an ideal kind of scenario, we would see 10 to 12 folk initially, growing to 20 cabins, and ideally growing to a second site of 20 cabins. So there would be 40 cabins, probably. Let's assume you've got three or four couples, 46, 48 people who are living rough, which would be about 2/3 of the folk that are identifiably living rough at the moment, who would be in a safe and secure situation, a 10 by 8 foot cabin, electrified, heated, with a construction trailer for washrooms and showers, school portable, again electrified, with a bit of a kitchen where you could meet. And up in Kitchener, they have I think 3 staff people. One lives full time on site. We're not at that point yet because we're not big enough, and about 70 volunteers. And the residents make their own breakfast and lunch and coffee when they want it. And there are groups in the city, mostly faith-based groups, that bring dinner in, and they all sit around the table and eat together and talk together and dream and scheme together.
Well, the reason why I ask is, I mean, listeners are going to remember last year the tent encampments in public parks in Hamilton, and how the criticism was needles, drug use, shady dealings, and whatnot. And I know that a lot of those people are going to listen to this podcast and say, "Well, we're just going to make it." You're now institutionalizing that. You're going to institutionalize drug use and bad behavior and criminality and whatnot on own land. And that's why I asked, what does it, does it look like that's coming down the pipeline?
That's certainly not the intent. All of the residents that come into the site will need to sign an agreement, outline, which, by the way, they'll have a hand in designing, outlining the terms and conditions. For example, I believe there was an instance in one of the cities with a better tent city where somebody had a weapon on site. Well, that was specifically excluded. If you bully people, or if you're involved in a crime, if you've got a drug habit you're feeding by stealing something, those things aren't tolerated by the community itself, and the community itself makes decisions about people who need to be asked to leave because of that. That's when you give or enable people to have some control over their own lives, and they seize it. There are some amazing, Joel, transformations that take place. Some have gone back to school. Some have found part-time jobs. There's a suggestion that's been made by a couple groups who want to help the Hats group here in Hamilton, because it's an 8-acre site, to plant a community garden where some skills can be developed, maybe some vegetables can be sold on the curb. And some of our currently homeless folk will not only have the safety and security of a sort of a gated community almost for homeless folk, surrounded by the support services, but also a way to earn some money and to be able to chart some new directions in their own life. We're very optimistic. We're very, we're idealists without illusions. Let's put it that way.
Certainly the initial reaction, public reaction, seems to be very positive, judging by Twitter and the usual stuff. And the initial council reaction has been fairly positive, in that at committee they unanimously supported it. Did I read that right? I read that somewhere.
Well, it's a mixed bag. There is a thing known as NIMBY, right? And not in my backyard. I've always believed that if you can't take care of your own backyard, you don't have any right to take care of anybody else's. But it begs the question, what is my backyard? In today's world where everything is so interconnected, one could make an argument that there are things happening overseas that could and should be considered as being in our backyard. Climate change, a lot of the other issues, health issues, the pandemic issue, that's in everybody's backyard. And and it begs the question too, it's almost biblical. I don't want to sound like a theologian because I'm not a theologian, but who is my neighbor? And, it's not just about me, it's, Bobby Kennedy said something to a group of his young followers back in '68 when I was down working on the campaign there. He said, we ought to love the poor and the vulnerable because we love them. But even if we can't get to the point where we say, I love you, we should get involved because it's clearly in everybody's best economic interest to do so.
Absolutely, yeah.
You read a story that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about Murray in Utah. It was entitled $1 Million Murray. It turned out that Murray was costing the taxpayers $1 million. And, he'd be 3 days in the hospital at $1,600 US a crack, in and out of jail, all the stuff. And the simple truth that came out of that article is if we put the pieces in place that people need and get out of their way so that they can actually access them, they can turn their lives around.
And it's that,
it's
that kind of thing we've talked for decades about the poverty trap. I'm seeing certainly, I think former Mayor Diani sort of said, why this good idea, but why this location? And my initial thought was actually the fact that it's a central location is a good thing, because it's easier for the services to, if you're homeless and you don't have a car, you don't have a whole lot of money, the last place you want to be is on the edge of town because you can't get to anything. Whereas if you're right downtown, and I think that it is visible. And the problem with homelessness is that we pushed it off our doorsteps so that it's hidden, and that way we don't have to deal with it.
We hide it. That's the goal. The local councillor in particular has been quite opposed to the site and has been, on again, off again. He says good things about the concept and he loves us all and, blah, blah, blah. But when push comes to shove, we know where he stands. The council, the committee of council, we're I think evenly split around the site, but everybody agreed it was great. I mean, we had both bishops, Hamilton bishops, participate in the presentation. It's pretty hard when you're looking down the nose of your own bishop and he's saying, "Hey, you got to get involved," right? And
well, there's one of the things that you mentioned earlier in our discussions, Ted, and it's that the philosophical approach to homelessness that this particular project is taking, and my thoughts were before the missions and the shelter system. The idea was always push the problem out of sight, out of mind, and
hide it. Yep.
And this notion of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and you did this to yourself. This is your, you got yourself into this problem, so therefore we don't really have to deal with it, but we'll give you some charity just to satisfy our own guilt, so to speak. But this takes a fundamental approach of let's actively help people put dignity back into their lives on their own terms, and empower them on their own terms. And then, as you said, I'm quoting you 5 minutes ago, get out of their way and see what happens. And I think that's a fundamental different approach to the homeless issue.
Joel, you're right. It's about dignity and respect. It's about being non-judgmental. It's about allowing for self-determination and community building. It's for acknowledging, and people in Hamilton didn't realize this until I made mention of it 6 years ago when I was Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing in the province. We worked with a group called Canada Counts and actually counted homeless people in Hamilton. And the number one cluster of people who are homeless in Hamilton are veterans, most of whom are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They tend largely to want to go to shelters because the military background has them desirous of structure. But the second most numerous cadre of people was Aboriginal folk, and living in the city, and followed closely by women and children escaping domestic violence. And each one of those groups, tugs at your heartstrings. And but you're right. As a basic philosophical approach, everyone needs to have the right to make decisions about their own life. We may not agree with those decisions. Those decisions may turn out to not be in their best interest. But the key is to create options and opportunities to maybe go in a different direction. That's what the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters is going to do. People will be given two keys. They'll be the only people who have the key, and when they leave their cabin, whenever they leave it, they'll lock it up. They'll take the key with them, and that's their place. And it'll be heated, electrified. There'll be a fridge in each unit. And opportunities for them to gather together, and who knows, a big soccer field there. Maybe even play soccer with some of the neighbors.
I mean, obviously, in recent months, both in Toronto and in Hamilton, there were major. There were the police were called in to clear multiple sites. I mean, one of them being John A. Macdonald, and with everything that came out of that in terms of. I can't really think of the right words to put this in right now, but it was obviously a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. And to an extent, you've already failed when it gets to that point. And this kind of approach seems to me like, okay, you're treating people with dignity, and you're also taking the police out of the equation because all the because you've got community support for what is happening. Now, I mean, I guess the other question I saw someone post on Twitter was, to what extent are the homeless people themselves involved in this process? Is this kind of the kind of white savior kind of approach of, we're going to sort this problem out for you, and you can accept it or get lost, or is this a sort of genuine partnership with the people themselves?
Well, it has to be a partnership, and we're working on that. We're only about a month into it, Roland, and we've made some outreach. We had agents, I suppose you could say, in the out of the cold system, doing some of the research for us. There was a group, I believe, about 20 homeless folk who were consulted directly. 10 thought it was a great idea and signed me up. The other 10 weren't so sure, but make sure my name's still on the list, right? And we think if we build it, they will come. And you mentioned the police. I just want to touch on that for a minute, because the police chief was part of one of our Zoom conversations with city staff, and the police services is very supportive. The Canadian Association of Police Chiefs wrote an actual paper about the concept and explained that essentially they'd much rather be, there's a lot of suspicion. It won't happen easily, but wouldn't it be great if we could come up with a scenario where a police person could visit the site, and because he's got a homeless friend there he wants to talk to, not to rip down and shred the tents, and the protocols around emergency. Right now, if there's an overdose in a neighborhood camp, neighborhood park, sometimes the EMS vehicles or the firefighters or the police spend an hour trying to find out where the tent is, where the problem is. But here you'd have a protocol. There would be a fairly clear understanding of what constitutes the ability to come on site, and there would be a relationship there. That would be in the best interest of the residents there and all the citizens of our good city, who have responded overwhelmingly. I think in the last couple of days since this went kind of semi-public, we've had about 7 offers of people want to donate a cabin. We've had business people come and say they want to canvass their business partners for donations. We've had I'll bet 30 or 40 people line up to volunteer, say they want to help. It's amazing. We've got the Chamber of Commerce is indicated by letter their support. The Roundtable for Poverty, the Social Planning Council, the Bishop of the Catholic Diocese, the Bishop of the Anglican Diocese, Rabbi Hillel, the Muslim Center, Hamilton Center, all kinds of faith groups, academics.
It's something that Joel and me have talked about a lot in recent months. Is I feel that there's a kind of appetite out there for new ideas in all kinds of ways. That we came through a kind of period maybe 10, 20 years ago where the successful politics was the most moderate kind of politics, and change was, people were kind of scared of change. And I think we're on one hand, it's a bad thing because we're seeing the kind of polarization that we're seeing in Ottawa this week. On the other side, it's good that we're seeing people who are like, okay, this is a new idea. This is completely something we haven't seen before. Let's give it a go. Let's try and do it. Let's try and do it quickly and not talk for 3 years about doing it.
I think that's. I think you're intuiting that very well. But we need to remember that the status quo tends to flow back to itself. When you say change is difficult, it is difficult. If there are, there's a status associated with homelessness that's not seen ever as being positive. There is a stereotype of what's going on. There's a clear fear of that. And we need to replace that stereotype, that misguided fear, with a sense of trust and willingness to risk and to journey a little bit together. You got to talk to some of these people. Your conceptions of homeless folk really change when you discover the person you're speaking to is back from his third tour of Afghanistan, and he's been involved in a number of firefights, and he's mentally ill as a result of it. He needs a lot of help, and we sort of shut them out of our lives and expect they're going to cope on their own when that's not always possible. We're in this together, whether we like to admit we are or not.
Ted, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to kind of put your hat on from a few years ago when you were an MPP for the region, because there's a theme that I'm detecting in our conversation is that the struggle of hope over fear, and I thought that this initiative really did get its momentum from the grassroots. This really is a grassroots motivated and grassroots driven initiative, and as a former politician, what? And I'm going to ask you to kind of maybe speak to your fellow politicians if they're sitting in power right now at Queen's Park or around the city council chamber.
That's what we're asking.
Wisdom to anyone who might be listening, and just say like why maybe they should not be as scared of listening to the grassroots or letting the people take the lead on something like this, and just saying, you know what, maybe it's best just to get out of the way and don't worry about getting into a committee that's going to drag this on for 3 years and come up with a 100-page report that sits on a shelf and nothing ever gets done about it because I'm afraid about my electoral chances.
Yeah, well,
what you say to that person?
That's so it's so prescient. I mean, you're right on. The difficulties around embracing alternatives is often tough. I've always believed that policy or political decisions ought to be ideally based on evidence, supported in principle, and designed to achieve the greatest good. And I suppose that depends on whose evidence you're looking at or what kind of evidence you want to find. But the simple reality is what we've been doing by and large hasn't been working. When I was Minister of Housing traveling around the province, and we did some really creative things in government and in that ministry, including leveraging the federal government into a federal housing policy. Quebec and Ontario had a major role in that, Joel, as you may recall. But all of that together, when we went around the province visiting social housing projects, those that had wraparound services, well thought out, well designed, relational wraparound services thrived. You not only survive, you thrive. Those that just put up buildings and said, okay, you're going to, it's low cost, but they never dealt with the fact that the housing itself wasn't the end of the journey. It was maybe the start. You still had to deal with the trauma. You still had to deal with the loneliness. You still had to deal with the presenting physical and mental health challenges. And some people couldn't cope. They'd be there for a month and then they'd be back on the street again because that's what they knew. And so we know what works. We just need to summon the courage to maybe move outside of our own experience. I have to summon the courage to move outside of my own experience too, to engage with a bunch of people that I really don't know anywhere near as well as I need to know. And my experience personally has been, as I get to know what's happening on the ground, my opinions of what is, what has been, and what could be has really changed.
It's another sort of aspect of what we've kind of discovered doing this podcast is how interconnected everything is. So we've had episodes on the basic income, the whole development industry in Ontario, the affordability crisis. All these things are also linked together, and yet we tend to treat them kind of in isolation. Now, and the mental health point is actually so important because it's long established that that mental health problems are very key in people who end up living on the streets for whatever reason. We're looking at the mental health system under OHIP is not as good as it as I think many of us would like it to be, in terms of, if you want to speak to a psychiatrist, you may be waiting 18 months, 2 years, something like that. And even then, you may not have easy access to the kind of ongoing support that you need. If you were still in government, what do you think the next step would be in terms of changing the mental health situation as kind of the other aspect, really, that is absolutely key to dealing with homelessness in the long term?
Well, you need to start with a part of it's resourcing, Roland. We added over $1 billion to mental health response, and then lost government, and things change. When governments change, things change. I don't particularly want to go there, but just to, to flag that. Mm-hmm. You're not looking for enemies; we're looking for friends, right? And that's a reality. We need to work from the ground up. When the Premier asked me if I would chair with the Deputy Premier an expert panel on homelessness back in 2016-17, I agreed on one condition. 1/3 of the members of the panel had to be either homeless or have lived experience of homelessness. And that made, we published a report entitled A Place of Their Own. And it projected that we would, through a variety of things, including the provision of fiscal support so people could compete in the market themselves, try to eliminate homelessness in 10 years. Interestingly, Hamilton's homelessness strategy mirrors some of that, and they want to eliminate homelessness in 10 years. So they talk about collaboration and cooperation and partnership and person-centered approaches, and the need to do capacity building on the services side. So everyone's beginning, and I give credit to the city. When I was minister, every time I came into the city and dealt with Indwell and others there, they did a very good job on the social housing side. Homelessness side was a little tougher to deal with, but they're onto it now. They're working hard at it, and we just want to be an honest broker and an authentic, modest addition to the efforts.
Ted, we're coming up on the end of the podcast time, and I only have one question to ask, and that's kind of, what do you see as the end goal of this, of HATS Hamilton? What if everything goes according to plan, what do you want to see this initiative ultimately become?
Well, this is a stopgap effort for hopefully as limited a period of time as possible, while governments at all levels and communities at all levels get serious about the need to provide supports required and the housing units required. If you think of the housing, in the last federal election, you'd swear, listening to the party leaders, that they were all out there with hammers and saws building the homes themselves. We'll build 1 million. Well, that's nothing. We'll build 1.4 million, whatever. Well, the truth is we don't build. Politicians, governments don't build housing. They may set a policy in place for that. We have to rely on people with that expertise. So we've got to find a way to merge private sector expertise with a shared sense of purpose and community benefit. Maybe that means guaranteeing businesses that they can make whatever profit they need to make in order to build a different kind of housing unit that's affordable for people. That's pretty radical, but I think that may be the way to go, particularly when we're talking about density and urban boundaries and all the fight about saving prime agricultural land. Talk about everything being connected, Roland. That's so true. So I hope it can be short term. I said to some of the people at Hamilton when we had Zoom calls with them, great, you're into permanent housing. You show us how you got a plan for that right now for everyone who's living rough, and we'll forget about the cabins. We'll just get on with our lives. Focus on something.
And it struck me that these cabins will be right next door to a former school that's currently sitting empty, that is looking for a new purpose. Now, I'm not saying that would be appropriate. I have no idea, but all of Hamilton's
it's falling apart.
Well, okay, so that's fair enough point. But I mean, it's there are not so many homeless people in Hamilton that they can all be housed on a site of that kind of dimensions, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
So achievable when you break it down to that kind of level. When we're talking about 100 people in the city of Hamilton. We're not talking about 10,000 people, but it shouldn't be beyond the wit of.
Well, it's more than that. The people, those who are using the shelters now, and the hotel and motel rooms
Sure.
the city has made available at some considerable cost, by the way, would probably number about 700, and we have reason to believe there are probably over 100 people living rough. So we may be upwards of, we may be even close to 1,000 people. But these are people that got to be treated decently and with respect and with hope and with supports. We have a sacred responsibility, I would argue, to do that.
You know what? I think that's the note to leave this episode on, Ted. So I'm just going to say we close off at that, and thank you very much, Ted McMeekin, for coming on and enlightening us and our listeners about the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters. My apologies.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do some sharing, and appreciate your taking the time to do this.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.